My name's John Welsh. I work in critical care outreach in University College London hospitals, and I've got a long-standing interest in the use of technology to enable us to identify deterioration and help manage it more effectively than we currently do. So I'm really excited to hear about this piece of work from a major multinational. I'm hoping that they've invested plenty in it and can tell us some of the things that we need to do better. And I'll pass you over to Sadia Khan, who works at West Middlesex Hospital and also at Imperial College, who's going to talk to you about what they've found in their study so far.
Thanks so much, John. I'm not a multinational here, in case there's any doubt, but I am a consultant cardiologist. I work in West Middlesex and so I'm joined by Mike, who's basically my fixer-upper and does everything for me. So he'll take all the difficult questions just so we're clear for when we get to the end. Conflicts of interest, just so you know, and I don't think that microphone is working. Definitely the first technical hitch. So my conflicts of interest is I've been doing work in the remote monitoring space for longer than I care to remember, but around 6 years. And we've worked with multiple different technological providers, including GE. So this talk is mostly about my personal journey. And I thought I'd nick my PhD student's first slide for the talk she gave last week. So this is to really tell you that story and to tell you about the journey that we've been on. I'm not sure how many people remember this, but this was one of the reasons I went into cardiology. So this is John Carter with his defibrillators in his first few weeks as a medical student under Benton. So now you all know how old I am. It also is to think about why it matters. So as a cardiology trainee, I was really used to the idea of having lots of data and monitoring things to make decisions on the treatment function and the treatment decisions that I would make. And when I got to my leadership role in the organisation, and this was probably about 3 or 4 years into my consultant journey, and I started to understand about risk registers and what organisational priorities were, and that not everybody cared about the heart as much as I did. As my respiratory junior said, remember Dr. Khan, A and B come before C, however much you would like to think otherwise. I realised that patient deterioration out on the medical wards, where I was now responsible for at least 4 of them, wasn't the same things that I was seeing on the coronary care unit and isn't the same things that I was treating on the coronary care unit. So that really got me interested because, like John, I'm interested in technology and how it impacts healthcare. I've always said that girls' toys are smarter than boys' toys, is to think about how we could do things differently. And we started to really look at what sensors and digital technology was out there and what we might be able to do differently for patients. Along that time of the journey, obviously, I went up through the Royal College of Physicians system. So I did their membership exams, then we get to fellowship, and we start to see what our colleges are doing in terms of leading quality standards. And the idea of physiological measurement, being able to track and trigger, was something new that came up in my training. So I was very familiar with teaching and training of the NEWS 2 system, and understood that actually it's not only about the earlier detection, so it's great to know something happens, but what can you actually do with that? How are you going to translate that into better patient benefit? So with the sensor and digital work that we were already doing in cardiology, we really started to look at that. And this work that I'm presenting is work done by 2 of my PhD students. As I said, I'm taking the glory, but I guess that's the joys of being the boss. And what I was really interested in looking at was what was out there on the market, were there sensors? And I know that John has done a lot of work in this area, probably much more than I did. And what I found is there was a whole plethora of stuff, particularly in the consumer space, but none of it really was answering the questions that I was interested in terms of healthcare, hard outcomes, but also patient and staff experience. So one of the first bits of work that we did was actually try and undertake a systematic review. What was out there in the literature in terms of understanding those things that we cared about? Was there a difference in those outcomes? So this was work undertaken by Meera Joshi, who was our first PhD student. And if you look at the numbers on this Prisma diagram, the detail isn't important, but she started with 3,300 records to review, and actually in her final analysis, only 16 of those got included. So it tells you something about the data gap and what we really care about. But what she was able to demonstrate, and this was specifically a systematic review of very mixed quality and mixed studies, is that there appeared to be a really clear trend in reduction in length of stay in the context of digital alerting and picking up patients who were deteriorating for sepsis. There was also a reduction in ICU length of stay in this meta-analysis, and we saw a trend, but no significant outcome in terms of mortality or in time to antibiotics in this particular piece of work we did. And the systematic review covered everything that was published up till 2019. So that gave us some idea to start looking at this area in a bit more detail. And this is the hospital that I work at, which is West Mid. So we're a really busy DGH. We're on the doorsteps of Heathrow. When I first started working there, I was amazed by the pathology that came through. I was like, I've never worked in a place like this before, and I've stayed ever since. So we took those unselected medical patients, because it's not just about what goes through intensive care. If I reflect back on COVID, the greatest numbers of patients who were cared for with COVID in our hospital weren't in the intensive care unit. They were literally on all our general medical wards. So the general medical wards and the general surgical wards carry the greatest burden of patients. And because of that, they probably carry the greatest risk in terms of undetected deterioration. So we started to try and look at lots of data and try and bring it together. It wasn't just what the sensors and what we were picking up in our EHR. It was data from everywhere. And just to show you what the group of people we look after, and just really to make the point that we look after a wide spectrum of people from different backgrounds, you can see that actually we look after people from all over the globe, and that reflects partly, as I say, where we're sited. So the data that we start to see is applicable across lots of different populations. The first bit of work we did, and this is now before COVID, remember, so our focus was a bit different. First bit of work we did was just say, well, do sensors work? Can we determine that what we think they're measuring is what they're actually measuring? We were able to evidence that actually they work really well. So I'm showing you some heart rate data, and the correlation was within 2 beats a minute, but we did the same thing for the other parameters. And then we said, okay, well, we can prove that they work now. They're measuring what we think they're measuring. Can we do something around understanding if they impact the outcomes? So can we look at speed of deterioration? Can we look at detection of sepsis? Can we look at what's happening? And in this study that was really a validation study before we did the clinical outcomes, I'm showing you a sample from one patient. We were able to see that actually, if we had a sensor and we used the sensor to generate alerts, we could detect on average about 2 hours before the nurse's obs would do. And these are the sort of alerts that we were getting. So we scaled them according to sort of news score. So what would trigger the news score of 5, what would trigger the news score of 7. And you can see that in roughly 15% of our patients, we were picking up deteriorations on the sensor. And most of these, the sensors were picking up before the nurses were on their obs rounds. But you say, well, that's all very good, but what did the patients think about this? So alongside this, and this is a 500-patient data set that we have in this particular study that we did, we were able to get 450 of them. So that's a 90% return rate, which is a fantastic return rate. It's much greater than I get on my ward feedback scores, to give us their feedback. And we also undertook some in-depth questionnaires. So these are the sort of results we get. And actually, it's really humbling to see what patients had to say. So overwhelmingly, the feedback was that the patients really liked these devices and felt that they were probably the devices of the future. And what I found interesting, because I was listening to some talks that John gave at a conference last week, is at this point, there was no alert being sent. So although we were monitoring them, we're not taking any clinical action based on it. But even with that, and that data has been replicated again in other studies, there was a very clear feeling of security for the patient population to understand that actually trusts are trying to do something different, and we're really focused on care and well-being. I'm going to skip that. So these were the themes. So when we mapped out the interviews, these were really the key themes that came out. So you can see the ideas that patients are giving around this being the way forward of the future. You can see the monitoring. You can see the safety feeling. What's really humbling is how worried patients were about staff. So when you drill into the details of the questionnaires, there's lots of comments about, it wasn't about doctors, by the way, in case anybody's wondering, it's about nurses. So there was a lot of detailed comments from patients about worrying about how hard nurses were working and being really clear about one of the key areas of focus for them was that actually to do anything they could to take the burden from nursing colleagues. There was no single comment about doctors, sorry. Linking, so the other question Mike and I were discussing on this on the way up is patients and staff for me are two flip sides of the same coin. You have to make things better for both for that coin to work and for the balance to be there. So we actually did ask the staff, and yes, I'm a physician and unfortunately these are all surgeons who are asked, but even I'll let them have valid opinions. So we got 48 staff members to complete, and as you can say, there are a range of disciplines and there are a range of different skills within it. So 12 of these people were consultant surgeons, so we're talking quite high ranking and people who are well embedded in their ways of working in terms of the feedback that we were given. And you can see that the staff experience has very similar overlapping themes to what the patients had to say. So there's a really clear focus on patient safety and detection, there's a really clear focus on technology, and there's a really clear focus on being clear that our current monitoring systems as we perceive them could be better and could have different opportunities within them. So whilst we were doing all of this, another little event came along, which was the COVID-19 pandemic, which none of us were clearly anticipating. But I think it's difficult to know at this stage what I call the COVID premium, how that's going to work out for all of us in the healthcare systems, particularly over this winter, which, to be honest, I'm not looking forward to. So what we chose to do was, rather than ditching the work that we were doing completely and saying, well, actually, the whole of my hospital is now turning into a COVID area, we can't be running these sorts of research studies because our staff are being redeployed, is because of where we sit, which is literally next to Heathrow, within a 10-minute drive. One of the things that was happening is we were getting travellers. So if you remember at the very beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, if the travel advice is confusing now, it was worse so back then. So we were working in an environment where we were being asked to set up healthcare facilities for people travelling who were landing at Heathrow in particular, where we didn't know what their COVID status was and we didn't know whether they had to quarantine. So one of the things we chose to do was actually engineer hotel rooms. So we knew that these people needed looking after. We knew that we had to put healthcare staff, including ambulance staff, into these facilities. But we were looking to do is see if we could use technology to make it safer for staff. And I don't know if anybody's ever seen any of these quarantine rooms in the hotels, but I went to visit and they're horrible in the sense that you are then if you can imagine a hotel room that's got a single bed in it, you're in that room for 2 weeks, your food gets delivered to you, you have no human contact, and if you have any worries or concerns, you have to ring someone who then has to put all the PPE on, make their way up to you, and then come and see you. And clearly we as staff were worried about that because we couldn't test for COVID, we didn't know what it was. It was a time of huge anxiety. So literally we undertook a study to see if we could engineer hotel rooms using this kind of digital sensors and what people would think about them. So literally sensors go in, bridges go in, we're trying to collect data. So just to share the results with you, we only managed to recruit 14 people into this study because by the time we got it set up, the lockdown happened completely and all flights in and out of the UK were pretty much put on hold. That's the joys of research, you work in a moving field. So we recruited 14 people, but we proved you could do it. And what we found was from the guests, the people who were staying in these hotels, actually the feedback was really positive. They really liked the idea of having a different monitoring system because remember, otherwise they're on their own in these hotel rooms. And for the staff, the feedback was very similar. Felt that the staff found that the technology really helped with their working and they felt it improved their level of confidence in terms of dealing with these patients. So, as I say, we use this as a proof of concept to say actually there are different ways to using sensors in terms of detecting patient deterioration, not just the classical News 2 system that we would all be used to. So I couldn't obviously have done this work all by myself. So there are a huge number of people who contributed. So I'm just saying thank you to them. And that's it for me. I think Mike, as we agreed earlier, was taking all the difficult questions. So the floor is all his. Thank you so much.
Can I start with a question?
Mm-hmm.
What next?
So actually, we're already working on what next. So I think there's no doubt that there's a huge amount of work to be done in terms of understanding where the real benefit of these sensors and digital alerting systems lie. And also, I think that COVID premium is a very real thing. So Mike and I, on the journey up, I was reflecting on my personal experience of being a respiratory lead in a hospital that's really hit hard by COVID and what this winter might look like. So I think there's a real benefit in these technologies in terms of helping us look after many more patients and keeping ourselves and patients safe.
Okay, thank you. So if we go into the audience, who here has got experience of this kind of wearable monitoring in their own hospitals? Anybody at all? So as a straw poll, who thinks or is fairly convinced that some kind of wearable monitoring, there are many different systems out there, would be useful in the hospital? Who is less sure? Put your hand up if you're less sure. Okay. Do you feel able to say why you're less sure? Maybe we can get a mic to you there.
Is it on? Yeah. I think from my perspective, it's the client group, the patient group that I deal with. My inpatient areas are community hospitals. We don't have medical teams on site. If there was a way of these monitors being centrally monitored at one of our tertiary providers, then I think it would be absolutely fantastic. But I'm not sure if the tech is there, and that may be my lack of knowledge rather than the actual system.
So I can tell you it's there, because for that hotel study, we were 4 or 5 miles down the road and we could still see it. So the tech's definitely there.
In that case, it would be fantastic. And can I have it tomorrow, please?
So in our work, and it's in the literature, there are concerns about a number of issues, and you've talked a bit about usability and patient preference. I think the things that come up very often are concerns about false alarms.
Yeah.
Actually, I was just reviewing a paper this week, which wasn't based on wearable technology, but it was based on a clever EHR algorithm that raises alerts with a combination of vital signs and bloods and morbidity and blah, 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 blah. And the finding in the paper was that there were a colossal number of patients who alert through that system who don't turn out to be particularly unwell. And that is a real concern. What are your thoughts about that?
So obviously I skipped over 3 years worth of work of my PhD student, but one of the things that we spent a lot of time doing was looking at the alerting thresholds and how we can design systems. So I don't think we've got the perfect answer yet, but it's definitely something that we've worked out, how you set some alerts and how the time intervals work and how you combine parameters to really reduce that. And the other thing is, until people implement them for their patients in their unit, you have to make them configurable so they can be changed. It isn't as if my patients aren't going to be the same as yours, and I'm not going to want the same alert and alarm thresholds as you will. So these sorts of things, in terms of co-design and co-production, I think can be done.
Okay. And the other concern that's raised, when maybe was alluded to there, is who's going to respond to these alerts? If there are more alerts than there are currently, I mean, maybe you can tell us whether you think there would be more alerts than there are currently, or do they just come earlier? And who is going to respond to them? Particularly if you're not in a hospital, or you're in a hospital that doesn't have a dedicated response team.
So I think it does depend, exactly as you say, John, on what cohort of patients we're looking after, what kind of alerts we're looking for, and what outcomes we want to see. So we've worked with a number of different models, so it's possible to generate these alerts locally. So for example, if you've got a particular bay or interest in an NIV bay, for example, those alerts and those triggers can be sent very locally to the care team that are looking after them, up to including every level in between, including to a centralised hospital response system. So, for example, I think the interaction between rapid response teams or critical outreach team or MET teams and these technologies is an area that's going to be really a strong area of focus in terms of implementation. I think you have to define what cohort of patients you're looking for at after, and also what question or problem you're trying to fix. So my first slide of let's start with why. What's your why?
Does anybody have thoughts about that question?
I'm loud.
There's a mic coming. You can be really loud.
I'm really loud. So my background's cardiology before I went into practice development at Northumbria, and we had a telemetry system, obviously very different, but monitoring system. And we monitored patients throughout the whole hospital from our little coronary care unit. And it was a real issue, who takes ownership. For all that we had the skills and knowledge to monitor their rhythms, the patient was, however many miles away on whatever ward they were on. And I think there does come that worry, because we spoke sort of in our teams of raising that alarm, and they're not picking up the phone, right, I need to leg it to the ward or whatever. And I think there is that real concern of ownership, especially if it is a community setting. That alarm's raised, and now who will attend to that patient? That is a bit of a worry. And I just speak from a telemetry point of view, from cardiac monitoring.
So I recognise your telemetry pain, because we do the same for the other floors, and they're like 3 floors between us, and they never pick the phone up.
Yep.
So that is obviously a problem we all deal with in the cardiology setting anyway. And what worked really well for us is agreeing that clear process and working out how we work together as teams. So technology doesn't fix that. That work we have to do alongside, and that goes back to the what's the why. It's not just the tech. The tech is there to do these things that we're asking it to do, but how we build the human element around that, both for the patient, for the staff, and for the organisation in terms of safety culture and what we prioritise. These bits are for us all as a community of practice to define. And my solution isn't going to be the same as yours, because my context isn't the same as yours.
When you said it can be tailored to each patient as well, is it on that basis it can be? So if it is a RSU where they're NIV, you would focus on your SATs, and you can literally make it individual. Yeah. Right.
Absolutely, you can. You can choose for your patient how you want that to be. Now, with that choice becomes another problem, because, it's like, what am I having? My children, what am I having for tea tonight? Too much choice can sometimes not be a great thing. So we definitely have, as organisations, I think, and as team leaders, to understand what core parameters we want to set, that people then I don't want people turning my apnea alarms off. I don't want people turning the asystole and VF alarms off. So that's the technology will let you do it, but organisationally, do we really want that to happen?
There's a question at the back, please. Far corner.
Hello, I work in a private provider, so just thinking about compliance, and some of the feedback may be, well, we pay to have people present on a very frequently increased basis compared to my previous experience in the NHS. And what are the type of devices that are actually, are we sticking on? Are we asking to wear wearable devices? What is it that they are actually going to have to do?
A combination of those two things. So you can tailor those for the patient. As I say, you don't have to have all elements. So it's a modular kit. You can choose the bits that you need to monitor. And I think when we were set out to do this work, which we started in a quality improvement and research space, it was very clear that this isn't about replacing staff. It's about providing additional tools for staff to do the best job they can. So that's one of the big worries that always comes up, is our CEO is just going to take the nurses away and then the doctors after. It's not about that. We all know, I work on enough wards to know it's the truth across every ward, that actually staff are really stretched, and it's really hard to deliver care to the quality that we want to. So it's got to be about augmenting care, not replacing it.
I mean that is a significant concern about staff. And I remember the Vitals study, the first Vitals study that came out a few years ago that was looking at some of this. And one of the points was made that you can save nursing time because it takes X number of minutes to do a set of observations.
4 in New Zealand, 9 in Hounslow.
Yeah, but if you multiply that up by the numbers of patients and the numbers of times you've got to do it, that's quite a lot of minutes. And in theory, you could take out staff, and people are anxious about that. In terms of the business model, what are your thoughts about how we can, or maybe that's a question for Mike.
That's a difficult question. That goes to Mike.
How can we show, in terms of a business model, that that there are benefits from these sorts of systems?
Well, I think, to be frank, I don't know if you can still hear me, but I think, to be honest, I think that's still an open question. So I spend a lot of my time sort of behind these systems, thinking about, the technical implementation issues and also the workforce and culture change. And the constant challenges I get are, there's an upfront investment in purchasing this technology and installing this technology, kind of where is the payback from this investment? I think the case for patient experience is clear, and I think the case for outcomes, I think there's an emerging evidence base potentially, although I don't think it's conclusive at this moment in time. But in terms of the economic case, what can we stop doing as a consequence of these technologies? What can we take out of services? It's not going to actively turn it on.
No, I'll bring it up for you.
Okay, sorry about that. So what can we take out or stop doing as a consequence, I think, is something that is very difficult to answer at this time. The sorts of conversations that I've had around this would tend to be, staff are stretched on wards. There may be gaps. So, we're trying to fill posts in services. The pressure to keep the maximum number of beds open as we can is enormous. And so, therefore, can we think about using technology to help us to innovate in the way in which we deploy our existing workforce across wards, and can we give teams the tools to be more effective? So one sort of obvious example might be that, at the moment, in terms of the observations, it's every 4 or so hours, a set of vitals will be taken, and that happens throughout the night. My wife, who was recently in hospital, one of the most annoying features of all of this for her was that when she'd eventually fallen asleep, someone would come along and poke her, wake her up, take the vital signs, and then she'd have to spend probably another hour or so trying to get back to sleep. And on this would go. I think technology can release staff time to be deployed to support the patients that they have, to encourage different types of interaction with patients. So rather than it being a transactional heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, temperature, whatever, it's a different type of conversation with a patient, a different type of interaction. And I think the sorts of things that teams kind of want to do rather than that kind of arm's length transactional side of things. So I think this kind of technology can help us to innovate in those business models. The thing that I sort of struggle to do is to turn that into a cashable value that I can put into a cost-benefit analysis that I can then take to the divisional leadership teams to secure the resources for that. So I think we're still looking to work through that. One of the things that I think we will look to take forward in future programs of work is to look at some of these underlying, sort of workforce issues, look at the impact on that patient journey through the general medical ward to discharge, and to see whether we can turn that into benefits that we can use to justify the investments in these sorts of technologies. So it's not a clear-cut answer, I'm afraid, but I think there is intuitively a case for this. It's just turning that into an objective cost-benefit analysis that we can use to justify the kinds of investment required to do this at scale.
Does anybody have any thoughts about how we can justify investment in these kinds of systems?
Hi, my name's Tara Marshall. I'm running a pilot for care homes using remote monitoring, a much simpler system that you're talking about, and that's about taking the early warning score, and I label it as obs in a box for them. But what we've tried to do with the data that comes out of that system is triangulate that with conveyancing data, with empty bed days for patients that go out of care homes and don't potentially go back to the bed that they were in before, and try and triangulate that as a cost benefit so we can support our CCGs to use technology in care homes and other innovations. So that's where we are with that one. But I don't know what your thoughts are on doing something like that.
So that's
well, so actually, I'd just butt in there and just ask a question. In the room, if we had the choice for our healthcare system of using lots of these devices in the hospital or out of hospital, and they might be in a care home and they might be at home, they might be for new discharges out of the hospital, who thinks the biggest benefit would be to deploy them in the hospital, or versus who thinks they would be best deployed at home? Who thinks they'd be best deployed out of hospital, the biggest benefit? Okay, so a reasonable number, and I assume that means the rest of you think that in the first instance we should have them in the hospital. Yeah. But maybe there's room to do both.
Actually, I sit on the fence. There's room to do both, and it's got to be about where's the best patient experience and best patient outcome. So my other hat is running these sorts of ambulatory services out of the home. So I haven't used tech that's this sophisticated out in the community, but I've used lots of other stuff. And I think it's all there for us to use and to work out what works best for us and our patients. Both are feasible.
Any other concerns that people might have about the introduction of these sorts of systems that will be useful for us to understand?
I'm lead for critical care outreach team in Coventry. I suppose my concern is really it's taking nurses away from the patient's bedsides, and there's nothing like an experienced nurse looking at a patient, and we're relying too much on data sometimes. There's lots of patients that we see that actually their obs are only mildly triggering, yet they're the ones that will end up being the sickest because that one nurse has took the time to go and assess that patient with experience and recognise that's the patient's at risk. But that's my...
And I agree with that entirely. So I'm, unfortunately for me, old enough to be classed as a senior doctor and have enough experience to do it. But if you look at our organisational risk register, every year for the last 5 years, failure to escalate and detect deteriorating patients is on there. And that's because the reality is that we have lots of junior staff who need more support. So if I had a magic wand and could get lots of experienced critical care outreach nurses, I'd love them for all of the wards and for all of my inpatient areas, because actually that hands-on clinical expertise and knowledge you can't replace it. But we don't have that luxury either. So it goes back to Mike's point. How do we use the resources we have to the best ability? And how do we use technology to help us provide those care models?
Do you have any thoughts about how, as well as capturing numbers and maybe waveforms, about other inputs from patients or staff might be brought into the system?
Absolutely. So we've moved to an electronic health record, and John's already alluded to the fact when he was talking about the paper that he was reviewing, is digital alerting isn't just about what sensors pick up, it's what information does the digital health record hold already, what information can we triangulate from other environmental sources, what staff are seeing, what's the patient experiencing. I think in the future we're going to see much more of this integration, and we haven't talked about artificial intelligence and automation, but that's probably the direction of travel.
Is there a way of patients directly interacting with the sensor system itself at present?
So not at the moment, but I think that's where we will go.
Yeah, okay. So within the hospital, the majority of people thought that maybe in the hospital was best, let's assume we can't put it on everybody from the off. Which patients would you put these devices on? What do you think? Who would you choose?
So can I answer that? Because I've tried all these models.
Yeah.
The first research study we ever did was patch everyone who came through our acute medical floor. And what we worked out really quickly was we were just spending a lot of money without much benefit. Because a lot of the experienced clinicians, the consultants, would come around on their post-take ward round and send half of them home. So we've patched them all, we've collected a bit of data, but nothing that's meaningful, and they were going home anyway. So we changed that to being people who were on the post-take ward round we were definitely certain were going to stay. So we'd already started to sift out. And the other thing we found, and I think you'll find that increasingly as COVID, the way we deliver healthcare in a post-COVID era has evolved, is patients who are coming through our front doors are much sicker. So we were getting an increasing number of people who were going straight up to ITU or unfortunately getting advanced care planning from the ED doors. But there was a cohort in the middle who were a bit too sick for our normal AMU, not quite sick enough for ITU, and that was the other cohort we picked. So I think it is about picking which patients we put them on.
Okay, so you can get a benefit there. And what do you think your hit rate is like? How many patients who, in retrospect, you would have liked to have monitored, did you actually miss using that kind of approach?
So to be honest, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm pretty confident that if I look at my data and I look at the literature, about 15% of those people will have deteriorated.
Okay. Okay. So, what next? What do you think? What do we need? What do we need next? In terms of the parameters that you're monitoring, is there another parameter that you'd like to add into the system in addition to what you're currently monitoring? What would that be?
So we're doing much more blood pressure and SATs monitoring than when we started out.
Okay.
And I think that's the other thing about post-COVID. I think oxygen SATs have really risen up. When we first started...
Or not.
Yeah, unfortunately. Or not is the problem. Risen up is good from a detection and deterioration point of view. But when we first started this work, we weren't measuring oxygen SATs, but I can't see how we don't in this current healthcare delivery. While COVID is a thing, we need that data.
Yeah, absolutely. So SATs and blood pressure. Okay.
SATs probably even more before blood pressure, as we said, A before B and C. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I think we're sort of just about approaching the end of our session. Do you want to say anything to close off?
No, just to say thank you so much for listening to my personal journey. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm always happy to chat.
Yeah, and I think what's really important, and that's what this event has really been about, is that there are a whole bunch of people working in this field, some with one company, some with many companies, some just thinking about it. And if we can actually share our thoughts and experiences across the different groups, that would be incredibly useful. We don't actually have a formal network to do that, although maybe the conference could help us with that. But at least two people who would be interested in linking up on your ideas. I'll be talking a bit more about our project this afternoon, actually, so you can hear about ours too. But we're open to all. So thank you very much. Thanks for coming.